Good evening. I'm Sam Stone, full-time professor and coordinator of graduate programs for the Department of Law at the Universidad de las Américas Puebla here in Cholula, Mexico. Welcome to this second webinar in our series titled The 2020 U.S. Elections, the Future of American Democracy. Tonight, we will be discussing the relationship between the political parties, their platforms, their candidates, over a range of issues, but with special emphasis on COVID-19, both the economic response and the health response. Before beginning, I'd just like to take a moment to mention that if you have questions or comments during our session, please put them in our chat on the right side of your screen if you're with us here in this room. If you're watching on Facebook Live, put your questions in the comments. We will be collecting them throughout the course of the evening. We will endeavor to answer them towards the end of today's session. Finally, as a general note, this event is being recorded for academic purposes. Joining us tonight to discuss these topics is Dr. Tom Sutton. Tom is a professor of political science and director of the Community Research Institute at Baldwin-Wallace University, which is located in Berea, Ohio, the United States. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political and Social Thought at the University of Virginia and holds a doctorate in Political Science and Public Policy from Kent State University. Tom serves as a political analyst for the Cleveland ABC affiliate, News 5, and provides state and national elections analysis for local and national media. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thank you for agreeing to come on the webinar.
It's great to be with you, Professor Stone.
Thank you. Well, on a personal note, I just want to mention, Dr. Sutton was once upon a time my professor in college. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, International Relations, History from Baldwin-Wallace University. And not only was he my professor, but he also gave me the first chance I ever had to go on screen or on the radio to talk about U.S. politics. I was 19 during the 2008 elections, and it's a really wonderful experience. And so not only is it an honor and a pleasure for us as an institution to have you with us tonight, but also for me personally to be able to share this space with you.
Thank you, Sam. It's great to be with you all.
Yeah, thanks. All right, well, let's get started. Before we bring in our students, who I know have prepared a number of very interesting questions for you, I was hoping you could give us a brief introduction into party platforms in the U.S. Sure. What are they? Why are they important or not, right? What are the platforms this year in a general sense, and sort of where the parties are headed?
Okay. So when we look at the party system in the United States, really we are talking about two major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. We do have other parties, in particular the Libertarian and the Green parties. Some states have other parties like the Liberal Party in New York, et cetera. There's a pro-life party in New York as well. That at that level may have some impact, but nationally and in most states, it's really the two main parties that are dominant. The platforms are adopted. We also, because of federalism, the federal, state, and local structure of our governance, the parties are structured in the same way. So you have state parties in every state that adopt their own state platforms, as well as the national party. And then you have that at the local level as well. So the parties really sort of gear up for the major platforms during the presidential years, and this year is no exception. However, we did see a big difference in that the Democratic Party platform this year that was adopted really tried to incorporate both some of the standard language that we typically see in Democratic Party platforms, support for marginalized populations, for welfare, social welfare programs, for economic growth, on the issue of abortion, for reproductive rights for women. This is where the parties are very different. The Republican Party is against the access to abortion. And also there is this progressive wing that has emerged in the Democratic Party that's much more liberal, much more to the left. And so that wing was incorporated into the platform in many ways, particularly through adopting many elements of what was proposed as the Green New Deal that we saw earlier in the beginning of the 2019-2020 congressional session. On the Republican side, because of the COVID crisis, basically canceling out both of the national conventions, which were done virtually, as much as President Trump tried to have a convention, the health issues just prevented it. And so the Republican Party said, we don't have enough delegates to gather to really create a national platform this year. And so they simply voted to extend and keep the 2016 platform that was adopted at their convention in Cleveland here 4 years ago. So for the Republican Party platform, it is really a continuation of what we've seen in the Trump administration, very much focused on economic growth through tax cuts, through trade deals that at this point tend to be more protectionist, bilateral, between countries, between the United States and individual countries. We saw the replacement of the NAFTA agreement with the new agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We've seen the tariff war, if you will, with China, trying to protect American jobs, bring jobs back to the United States, and also protect American intellectual property. And of course, we've seen much more restrictive policies related to immigration from the Republican platform compared to the Democratic platform. So I think that sort of gives you some outline. And again, I would just suggest that the Republican Party, because it's the incumbent president, there is less of an emphasis of doing something new and different compared to when you're the challenging party and your candidate is challenging the incumbent, which is the case this year with Joe Biden as the Democrat versus President Trump.
Yeah, this is somewhat historic, right? The fact that the Republican Party did not develop a new platform in a presidential election year. My understanding is it's been at least a century, right, since the two major parties did not produce a new platform during an election year. Is that correct? Yeah. I think we're having a little bit of trouble hearing your audio, but yeah. It's been a long time, right, since either party has been able to go into a presidential election year without creating a new platform, right? Usually you want to update what you stand for, right? Keep some core values, but then continue with them, and that didn't happen this time. All right, well, let's see if we can bring our students in here. We have got three of them participating with us tonight: Mireya Rosado, Valeria Winkler, and Natalia Moraita, who are going to be asking some questions of you, and hopefully we can answer them over the course of the evening. And then at the end, right, we'll bring in our questions coming from Facebook, coming from chat, and talk about them as well. All right. So, Mireya, if you'd like to go ahead and ask a question, we can get started.
Hi. So thank you very much for this. I'm very honored to hear you tonight. Thank you for this conference, first of all. And so the first question would be this: during the Democratic primary, the division inside the party was especially emphasized as one of its greatest weaknesses. How did the party manage this division during drafting its platform?
Dr. Sutton, I think we're still having some trouble on the audio side. I'm not sure why.
Hola Mireya, buenas tardes. Por favor, ¿podrías acercarte un poco más al micrófono para poder plantearle la pregunta al doctor Sutton? Gracias.
¿Me escuchan?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, during the Democratic primary, the division inside the party was especially emphasized as one of its greatest weaknesses. How did the party manage this division during the drafting of its platform? Could you hear me?
I think we still can't.
Dr. Sutton, I think we can't hear you.
I think we still can't hear you there, too. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what. There we go.
Is that better?
Yes, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So with the freshman congresswomen who were really considered the core of the progressive wing of the party, in particular, Alexander.
Doctor, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I think that we can't hear you because you have something in your microphone. Maybe you can, with your headphones, we hear you better.
Okay, I'll go back to the headphones. Is that any better?
Okay.
Better?
Much
Yes.
better. Thank you. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
No,
All
that's
right.
okay. It's been an issue. I'm sorry. So the Green New Deal, which was introduced, and this was a very wide-reaching proposal, with the core element being to reduce emissions by the United States to zero by 2050. But what it really incorporated was a heavy focus on switching energy sources to renewable energy, which meant a jobs program, renewable energy development, and also incorporated elements of job training, education, et cetera. Very big, ambitious program. And that was largely adopted in that 2020 platform by the Democratic Party, and is part of what Joe Biden is running on. This is a program that will cost probably in the neighborhood of $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion over 10 years. But it incorporates elements of the environment, energy usage, and really looking at it as an economic driver of new jobs that would replace the fossil fuel industry jobs that we have currently, particularly in the areas of coal, oil, and natural gas. The other part of it, of course, was the Medicare for all for the healthcare. Biden and the Democratic Party have stopped short of expanding Medicare to all Americans, and instead are looking to expand Affordable Care Act that was passed under the Obama administration. And his goal is to have 97% of Americans insured under the Affordable Care Act by 2025. That would mean an increase of about 8.5% of Americans that currently are not insured. So it's a bit of a difference. It's essentially accepting the current healthcare system of private insurance and public money, rather than completely replacing it with a publicly funded system. I think those are the two main drivers of the platform. And of course, there are the other elements where there's largely agreement: civil rights protections, protections of rights for the LGBTQ communities, and certainly civil rights related to African Americans, Latinos, Latinx, and other populations that have had issues with protection of their civil liberties and civil rights.
And so just to follow up on this a little bit, right, does this incorporation of these two very important progressive policy proposals championed by people like Bernie Sanders, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is this incorporation of them into the platform this year changing some of the dynamics that we saw in 2016, where maybe the progressive wing of the party wasn't fully behind Hillary Clinton?
Yes, I think that's very much. And I think in 2016, quite frankly, I don't think the progressive wing of the party was taken very seriously. I think the Clintons really represent, because think of it, when Bill Clinton was president, he represented what they called the third way, which was really a moderate version of Democratic policies. And that was following the 1988 collapse of the Michael Dukakis campaign, the 1984 drubbing of Walter Mondale by Reagan when he ran against him. So the party thought they needed to move to the middle. And that's what happened with Clinton in the 1990s. I think Hillary Clinton in many ways adopted that same kind of platform. But instead, the progressives rose. And we saw longtime Democratic incumbents being overthrown in primaries, including the primary of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. And in their rising and being very vocal and outspoken, we saw the beginnings of a shift of the party towards the left, towards this what they are calling the progressive caucus. So I think in that respect, there is a big difference. And even the Obama administration, as much as Republicans might see them as having been too far to the left, many Democrats were disappointed with the Obama administration not being more progressive. Now, when you're trying to rescue a country from a recession, the scope of what we had, progressivism is not at the top of your agenda. It's really about just trying to restructure the economy to get it back on its firm footing. So I think those would be some of the basic differences that we would see. And Biden is stuck in the middle because he's seen as a moderate. he has adopted several of these more progressive policies in his own platform that he's running on. But even with that, I think there are some progressives that wonder, given his history, particularly issues of crime and crime control, his voting for the crime control acts of the 1990s, going all the way back to the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas back in 1991, and how he treated Anita Hill, who was the employee who accused Thomas of sexual harassment and who was treated very badly by that committee that was chaired by Joe Biden.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think going into this year, maybe part of the cohesion that we seem to be seeing in the Democratic Party right now, maybe is also a response to Donald Trump more than it is an enthusiasm for Joe Biden as a candidate now. So yeah,
absolutely,
great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would just add that that
Yeah.
is one of the biggest risks of this campaign, because Hillary Clinton spent a lot of time talking about why she should be elected, and it was because she wasn't Donald Trump. There's an element of this campaign that's starting to sound very similar, and clearly it didn't work 4 years ago. So now Trump's been president for 4 years, so he has a record that we're voting on, and it is a referendum on his record. But even still, Democrats would be very clear to Maria's question: what do we stand for? What will we do if we get elected? That is the bottom line that they have to make very clear.
Yeah, completely, right? I mean, I think a party and candidate who doesn't have a message of their own, even if the other candidate is part of that message, is we don't want to be like them. They need to be able to present something of their own. So
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you. That was wonderful. Could we get Valeria Winkler? I think you're there, and I think you have a question that has to do a little bit with the Republican side of things.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
I sure can. Very good.
It's an honor to have you tonight. I'm really pleased to hear you and learn from you. As Dr. Stone said, my question is regarding the Republican Party. I would like to know, what does the current Republican platform tell us about Donald Trump's relation to his party?
Thank you, Valeria, for the question. It's a good one. It's a very good one. President Trump, I think President Trump has managed to become the leader of the Republican Party, and the party has reshaped itself to his agenda. It's really quite remarkable the degree to which he has succeeded in that. And he's done it through the base of support he has among the grassroots, the fact that he's converted many Democrats to voting Republican, blue collar workers, white males with high school educations that tend to be blue collar. And he's making inroads in other groups. Latino support for Trump has been rising compared to 4 years ago. So in terms of the party relationship, I think the party has come together with Trump in many ways, particularly on the issues of immigration control, trade policy, which was a big change from where the party had been before he became president. They were much more internationalist and globalist than they are now. They're much more protectionist now than they had been. Interestingly, that is actually something that Biden is also adopting, and he had been more of an internationalist. So there's a coming together in both parties in that sense. And then certainly this idea that the economy took off under Trump, that's the way they present it, because of tax cuts, deregulation, and that they will continue those policies. So in that sense, I would say the party's platform, part of it is what he has adopted for his own, and a big part of it is what he has shaped, and is quite different from what, if you went back to, say, the 2012 platform of the Republican Party, and even before that, and most particularly when it comes to international relations and trade. I would also note where they very much come together is in some of the foreign policy issues, the withdrawing of troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, which has gradually occurred. And the real elements that I think he's running on hard is what they've done in the Middle East with Israel. And so I think he's split a lot of Republicans on that one, but there are many who see the siting of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem as a long-standing desire that has been achieved. And he may even peel away some of what normally would be moderate Democratic Jewish vote on that issue, coming over to possibly voting for him this year.
So it sounds like, just to follow up on this, right, that President Trump has been able to, in some places, right, increase his coalition or expand his coalition. And yet, right, the averages of the polls have him down by 7, 8, 9 points nationally, right? And he doesn't seem to be gaining that much in the swing states except in Florida. So where is he maybe losing some support because of this platform, because of these policies that he adopts?
Well, I think the COVID crisis is definitely affecting him, and it's not in a positive way. There was a possibility that people might not hold him responsible for what's happened with the federal response. One has to remember that as a conservative Republican, or at least the way that he's been treating the administration, that kind of political ideology tends to say it's the state's job to handle an issue like this more than the federal government. And that is very much what he has done. But at the same time, that hasn't really worked related to how the COVID crisis has unfolded. There was all the talk about how it was going to be ameliorated during the summertime because we'd be outside and we wouldn't be in school. And in fact, we had more spikes in the summer than we did in the spring. Now we're getting into the fall and the flu season. So, and some of the people who were voting for him are some of the ones most severely affected by the crisis, and this would be older Americans. So I think he's losing support among some of those groups that may have voted for him 4 years ago. The other is that he may be a bit of a victim of his own success when it comes to the judiciary. He has successfully appointed very conservative justices, 2 of them to the Supreme Court, to give them a solid 5-4 majority. He's appointed many judges to the federal bench, all conservative. And so there may not be as much of a priority for continuing that for 4 years in light of other things that people have problems with. And I would suggest the COVID crisis is definitely at the top of the agenda for issues that are perhaps causing people to think twice about voting for him again.
Yeah, and just for some of our listeners who might not be that familiar with this importance of judicial appointments in the United States, for conservatives, this has long been an important issue because it is often the Supreme Court and the circuit courts, the courts of appeal at the federal level, that are deciding social issues, things like access to abortion, gay marriage, and so on, right? And so the importance of these judicial appointments to social conservatives traditionally has been extremely key, right? And now maybe, as you're saying, he has kind of done that, right? And therefore, there's not so much of an incentive for them to support him on that front. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I would just also add that whoever becomes president, whether it's President Trump getting reelected or Joe Biden, at some point we're going to have to face the issue of the burgeoning federal debt. So the United States will be ending its fiscal year in less than 2 weeks with a $3 trillion deficit, the highest deficit we've incurred since the end of World War II. Our debt will exceed $20 trillion or $23 trillion, depending on how you count it. Social Security IOUs go both ways. So we are on the verge of exceeding our national GDP with our debt, which puts us in the rank of such fiscally responsible countries as Italy and Greece and other places like that. Whoever becomes president or stays president is going to be hobbled by that reality, I think. No matter what happens with interest rates, et cetera, with the Federal Reserve, it's going to make continued high levels of spending much, much more difficult. Now, to some degree, that might actually be a benefit to President Trump because spending is not as much of a priority as tax cuts and deregulation. However, I don't think he's going to get much more in the way of tax cuts after the 2017 package that went through, again, because that also contributed to the rising deficits.
Yeah, right. Historically, and just I guess the last follow-up I'll do on this, right? Historically, the Republican Party had, at least in its rhetoric, been considered themselves fiscal conservatives, right? By which they wanted to sort of limit the annual deficit and try to cut the national debt, right? That seems to have also shifted at least a little bit under President Trump.
Oh, absolutely. And I would suggest that that's shifted even before President Trump. If we go from the time of Reagan to now, Reagan thought he could get tax cuts, but also get military spending increases and cut spending on the social side. But to get his military increases and tax cuts, he essentially said to the Democratic Congress, you can continue to have your social spending. And as a result, deficits ballooned and we had a big recession, et cetera. In the 1990s, it was under Clinton that we saw actually deficits decrease, and we ran a very brief surplus from 1998 to 2000. Bush came in as president and said, well, if there's a surplus, we have to give that back to the taxpayers. And so we had another tax cut. And then we had, of course, the Great Recession. I don't necessarily blame him. Of course, the Great Recession. Deficits have risen under the last 3 Republican presidents. Deficits have either stayed the same, risen, or shrunk under the 2 Democrats that we've had in that time span. So I suppose you could say it's a wash either way.
Yeah, it sure seems so. I mean, I just, as a note, right, I became politicized. I grew up in the era of George W. Bush, and that was a big thing that we always pointed out then was, hey, you're talking about cutting the deficit, and yet your tax cuts are, at least in part, leading to this ballooning deficit and debt, right? But yeah.
It's become such a big problem that neither candidate wants to talk about it. You don't see anything in the platforms this year about cutting the deficit. You see nothing about a balanced budget plan that used to be routine in the 1980s and 90s. Every year we talked about in 5 years, in 10 years, et cetera. Now they don't even talk about it because it's the thing that nobody can do anything about, or at least they don't think they can. It's gotten so large. It's become, and it means painful choices on either side. No one gets anything out of deficit reduction.
Right, and actually, this brings me maybe to the next questions that I think our students have prepared for you, right, which have to do with COVID and the health response and the economic response to COVID, right? We could definitely point to the COVID response being partially responsible, right, for this increase in the deficit this year, for sure, right? And so I want to open the floor then to Mireya again to see if she could ask the next question related to COVID.
So my video is blocked, so I will just ask my question.
Sure, go ahead.
Without video, so yeah. Okay, so the next question would be, which are the proposals of the Democratic Party to combat the crisis resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic?
So the Democratic Party, first of all, you see the Democratic Party sees the Republicans under Trump as not trusting science, and that they are more concerned about keeping the economy going and keeping the economy open than about actually directly addressing the COVID-19 crisis. That's the rhetoric that the Democrats use. Their plan actually is to increase significantly funding for testing, funding for relief. The HEROES Act that passed in May in the Democratic side of the Congress is about a $2 trillion package that would essentially repeat what was done in April with unemployment compensation, the Paycheck Protection Program, a lot of other things. But they're really focusing more on prevention through testing, treatment, increased treatment, and dealing with the economic shortfalls that might result from things like shutdowns, lockdowns, et cetera. On the Republican side, there's a very big focus on getting a vaccine to then get people vaccinated, and that will end the crisis completely. There's much less attention to issues of testing, and certainly a wariness, particularly because this has become politicized, about anything that might lead to another economic shutdown such as we experienced from March through May. And I think that's really the big difference between the two. The trust in science, I think that really becomes the issue of President Trump himself. Some of his rhetoric, some of the people that he's put into positions to try to control what the scientists at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, have been doing, the Federal Drug Administration, Health and Human Services Agency, which is over both of those. And that's created a lot of negative publicity, and it's created fear and uncertainty among people who say, well, what should we think if we can't trust what the president is telling us? And even some of his hardcore supporters, it's hard to keep making the argument that the media is going after President Trump when it's very clear that he's doing and saying things that either aren't true or exaggerated, et cetera.
Yeah, completely. And I guess as a follow-up to that, why has Trump sort of taken this path where he seems to be moving against or going against some of the advice of some of these experts, right? Because it would seem that electorally for him, it would make sense to sort of at least look like the serious person in the room, right, when it comes to the COVID crisis. So why do you think he's chosen to take this path?
Well, I think for President Trump, this goes back to his background as someone who built a whole career on marketing. And for him, marketing is always about the good story, not the bad story. And so, what he's been trying to do with the COVID crisis, as he admitted in response to what he said to Bob Woodward in the book Rage that just came out, he said, well, I underplayed the severity in February because I didn't want people to panic. Now, that's understandable, but it's quite different to present what's happening and tell people, here's why you should have confidence in us to go forward, versus, well, we're just not going to tell you and we're going to underplay it. And hopefully through that, nobody will really know, this thing will go away and then we'll move on to the next issue. And I think that's what wound up happening. And because this hasn't gone away, because it continues to evolve into different levels of concern and crisis in different parts of the country, he continues to struggle with how does he manage that storyline. And so he manages it by essentially ignoring it. And putting people in place in these agencies that are trying to report the truth of what's happening, whose job it is to do so by congressional statute, to gather these statistics and report them publicly so that medical providers can work with that data to be able to prevent further spread. And he's putting essentially PR people in to say, no, you can't release this, or you need to massage this report. And it sounds very partisan to say that, but this is what's happening. This is the facts on the ground. It's been reported and verified by many different sources. I think one sign of that is that we have not seen the Fox network do much with trying to counter this set of revelations that have been happening about what the Trump administration has been doing. And if they're staying quiet about this, that tells you a lot about the reality that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think it's also hard to counter the president on tape, right? Especially when that tape's coming from Bob Woodward. But it's definitely something that I think they think they realize we probably can't really control, right? And so it's just going to be out there, and like you said, they're just trying to ignore it, and hope that people forget about it when they go to vote in November, but also in advance, right? Because as we know, they're already voting, right, in various parts of.
Oh yes. Yeah. So to that point, Sam, I should tell you, we've been tracking the requests for absentee ballots in Ohio. And in many of the counties, and these are across the board, the Trump counties, of which there are many in Ohio, the ones that will likely go for Biden, like Cuyahoga County, where we are, and the swing counties that have gone for Obama and then went for Trump. Across all of those counties, the percentage of requests for absentee whoever becomes president will be president or state 30%. And we still have 40 days left to go before the election. This is of what was requested in total 4 years ago. So there's a big uptick in people seeking ballots, and that may be an indicator of an increased turnout of votes, though ballot requests versus actually showing up in person are two different things, and it's hard to say, but there's clearly a lot of interest in voting this year.
Yeah, it's hard to say who that's going to favor, right? Because I think there's some rhetoric out there that mail-in voting or absentee voting somehow benefits Democrats, but it's really not that clear that that's going to be the case going forward.
No, because the typical user of a mailed ballot is a regular voter, and the demographics of regular voters tend to trend older, tend to be white, and that then starts to align, at least in part, with those Trump voters from 4 years ago. Not entirely, but at least a chunk of that would be in that demographic.
I see we have some questions here in our chat, but I'm going to let Valeria ask a second question related to COVID, and then I'll come to these questions in the chat, and we'll continue from there. Valeria, go ahead. You have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so my next question is, How has Trump's response to COVID pandemic has affected the economic and his standing in the election?
That's a good question, Maria. It's on one level, it's difficult to see the connection between his response and the polling data. We really can't disaggregate that, although we are seeing that questions asked about, do you approve of how the president is handling the COVID crisis? The percentages of approval are much lower than they are for how he's handling the economy. He does very well on that question. He does not do well on the COVID question. Biden does better on the COVID handling question, but it's a bit of a hypothetical question because he hasn't been handling it. He's simply been commenting about it. And so I think in some states like Florida, the Midwest, where there's a lot of Trump support, but also a lot of older voters, that's where we may see this crisis affecting his vote. And some of that vote either may peel away to President or to Vice President Biden, or may not vote at all. And it may be that they don't vote not because they don't want to vote for President Trump, but because they can't vote because they're too afraid or because they're sick and they're not able to. But either way, I think that combination is having a potential negative effect on his vote total.
I'll actually follow up here with a question from our chat, which kind of goes towards that. And it's basically, how is COVID-19, or sort of in your perspective, how much maybe is COVID-19 really, and the handling of that is really affecting Trump's chances? I mean, will we be seeing the same sort of numbers in the polling, right, which again are on average showing Joe Biden up nationally by 7, 8, 9 points? Will we be seeing the same sort of election if COVID had not happened, at least in terms of the numbers?
Oh, great question. So if we did not have the COVID crisis and Joe Biden was the candidate, we would presume then that we would still be in an economy with a 3.5 or 4% unemployment rate, which would be very low, a stock market that would be doing very well, which it's apparently still doing okay, and I don't understand that part. I think in that case, people tend to vote the economy first. Like him or not like him, President Trump would keep his core support and probably win over a lot of other support of people who have seen the answer to the Reagan question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And for many people, the answer is yes. And that many people includes low-wage workers, African Americans, Latinos, women, the demographics across the board. Everybody has benefited from this. And Democrats sometimes make the mistake of running, well, on income disparity or wealth disparity. Look at all those wealthy people and where are you? That's not how most people think. It's not about what the other people have. It's about, am I okay and am I getting better? That's where people tend to think. And so billionaires, okay, fine, there's billionaires. That I don't really care that much. It's about where I am as a person, as a family, taking care of a family. So layer on the COVID crisis, and it's a whole new dynamic. And part of the problem for Trump is that it's revealing some of his worst tendencies, this tendency to prevaricate, to exaggerate, to do anything he can to make the story look good and make himself look good. And when the economy's going well, he can do that. And people will forgive him his little peccadillos. But in this situation, that's a crisis that are affecting potentially everybody. And I will tell you, just parenthetically, my wife and I are both people who have recovered from COVID. We both got it this summer. It was mild. We were fine. Please don't worry. We were fine. But that potential of anyone can get it and you don't know creates this fear and uncertainty. And people do start to say, well, what has he got to do with this? And is he doing something that's actually going to help me get over this? And that's, I think, where his election chances are much more uncertain than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I know very anecdotally, but my grandparents and many of the friends, they're in their 90s, have shifted some of their views over the last few months because of COVID. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think this fear is definitely having an impact on people's choices. So I think with that answer, we kind of covered a couple of the questions in our chat here. So I wanted to move on to something a little bit related, right? A little bit different. And the question is, will voter suppression play a role in the outcome of the 2020 presidential election? And if so,
Great question. So we've had this divide between Democrats and Republicans for several years now. Republicans claiming that there's always the potential for voter fraud, and so we need to tighten up things like registration requirements, voter ID, calendars for voting, et cetera. Democrats who say there's no evidence of massive voter fraud. In fact, the most significant fraud that's happened in the last 15 years was the Republican running for re-election in his congressional district in North Carolina, where they actually had to rerun the election 2 years ago. So if you want fraud, that's where it happened. There was a lot of just old-fashioned ballot stuffing. But many of these states are still keeping to the laws that they have on the books related to ballot access. Florida has put up several barriers to the ballot access that was supposed to go to former felons who had been released and who had gotten the franchise to vote through a popular referendum. Many states, we see in Ohio, efforts to try to increase the excess of boxes where you could drop your mailed ballot instead of putting it in the mail because of all the concerns about the Postal Service being able to deliver on time. And the Secretary of State saying, that's a really great idea, but I can't let you do that because of some lawsuit. And we've had back and forth about that. Other states are still requiring an excuse to vote absentee, to vote a mailed ballot, and haven't changed those laws. So I think that those things will still have an effect. The biggest effect will be those states that on election day, and this may not be intentional, but it will be in effect, on election day don't have as many polling places open as they had planned because they don't have enough workers. Because the typical worker at a polling place is somebody who is older, who is retired, who takes that day to do their community service and get their little stipend and does it each year, year in and year out. But they are the ones most directly affected by coronavirus. So as a result, we saw this in the primaries. We saw several places. You saw the lines in Wisconsin in March and April in other states where lines standing in the snow, people trying to vote because they'd cut the number of polling places in half or more. And something like that will more than likely happen in many states, and it will make it much more difficult for people to vote. And I think that will have a negative effect on turnout.
Yeah, right. So it sounds that maybe the laws aren't changing that much, except in a couple of states. What's going to be changing are two things, right? One, that many more people will be requesting or are already requesting, as you mentioned earlier,
Yes.
Absentee ballots, right? Mail-in, same thing as mail-in ballots, basically. And secondly, right, as you said, that because of this lack of poll workers, we're having this issue where there just might not be as many places for people to vote, right? So on election night, not only might we see a delay in counting all these mail-in ballots, we might also see these long lines to polls, right? And the law in most states, correct me if I'm wrong, says that if you're standing in line at the time the polls close, you still get to vote, right? So if we have these long lines of people waiting, we might be well into midnight or past midnight, potentially, and still see some people who are waiting to participate and exercise the right to vote.
The other part to this is, when will we know the results? So with this very high usage of the mailed ballot in states, some of them like Ohio that have been using it for 15 years on a regular basis, and others that are only using it for the first or second time, in both cases, the likelihood is that we will not know those states' returns the next day. There's one scenario that a consulting firm in DC sketched out a few weeks ago, where they said that the initial returns will be of those that voted in person. And those returns will possibly show favoring President Trump. So that the early calls by the media, et cetera, may say that without counting the mailed ballots, it looks like President Trump's ahead in all these different states. But that in the coming days, the mailed ballot returns will then begin to be reported, and the tide will shift, and it will shift more towards Biden. But we may not know for a week, 2 weeks, or more who actually wins this election. And that's presuming every state's ballots get counted and are certified as valid returns, and we don't wind up with another situation like 2000 in Florida, where we had the Supreme Court intervene. I've actually sketched out scenarios for the constitutional issue of throwing the election into the House and the Senate. And here's a really interesting point. The current delegations, if it goes to the House for the president, each state gets one vote. Presumably, the states vote based on the majority party of that state. 7 states only have one congressperson. including 4 of the Western states that are all Republican. So here's your scenario. Currently, 26 states have Republican majority delegations, 23 Democrat, 1 Pennsylvania is split. And the one toss-up seat in that state is Republican. So you could conceivably have Pennsylvania go with 1 more Democrat, becomes Democrat. You could have one of those states like Montana maybe go Democrat because it's an open seat election. You could have a tie in the House, and we don't know who the president is, which defaults to the Senate that picks the president, the vice president as president. And it could be Mike Pence because they have a majority Senate. Those delegations are majority Republican. Sorry, that was a long explanation, but it's one of these fantasy scenarios that we political scientists love to play around with.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I think it's something that we're all kind of interested in. For our listeners here in Mexico, maybe don't know the minutiae, right? The process is if the 2 candidates, if there's no winner of an absolute majority in the Electoral College, in particular, in our case, they would tie, right, at 269 Electoral College votes each, then the election is decided by the House of Representatives, but not with each member voting individually, but as Dr. Sutton said, with each delegation from each state. So each state gets 1 vote. So a majority of House members are Republican in that state, then that state's going to vote for the Republican candidate. And it's a whole situation. We've never faced that in modern times, at least. But it's always something that's kind of out there. So great. Well, let me move on here to a couple of other questions in the chat. We have a lot of different questions here. One which maybe can sort of be answered succinctly, right? It's sort of what is the expectation on the stock market if Trump is reelected?
That's a really good question. We saw the market react dramatically 4 years ago when he was first elected, and then it stabilized and started to grow. I think if Trump is elected again, we'll see the market continue its upward trend. If Biden is elected, we'll probably see a little more instability, but it will not be that dramatic. Part of that is also that the stock market is following its own sirens that don't seem to have a lot to do with what's happening either with who's in the White House or with the coronavirus crisis. We saw the tech stocks raise them to new heights, and then the next week they fell because there was some lack of confidence in tech stocks. And I still don't understand why. I read the Wall Street Journal every day and I still don't get why. So it's a great question about the markets. I don't think in either case we're going to see some sort of a crisis response by the markets or a rush to gold, partly because gold is so expensive nobody can buy it anymore anyway. That one's out. So I don't think we're going to see that much of a negative reaction in the markets or fear that we're going to suddenly become a socialist country if Biden gets elected. I don't see that.
Yeah, and I guess what I would add there, right, is that President Trump likes to, and many politicians, right, of both parties have historically pointed to the stock market as an indicator for how the economy is doing. And while oftentimes the economy and the stock market are kind of doing well or doing poorly at the same time, that's clearly not the case in many instances, including right now, right, where we see these terrible economic conditions due to COVID, right, and the COVID pandemic. And yet, as you said, the stock market is still through the roof, right? So I think while we are all kind of looking at the stock market, it's not necessarily the best indicator for how the economy might do broadly, right? So just
I think the more trusted number is the unemployment numbers, and those have been going down, but they've slowed down their descent. We're at about 8% right now nationally. There's sectors of the economy that are doing better and other sectors that are stagnant, in particular travel, entertainment, because you simply can't fill a venue, right? We're into the National Football League season, and they're allowing 10% of the seats to be filled or 15% of the seats to be filled. The NBA is playing in a bubble in Florida. And so that's billions of dollars of economic revenue that is just not happening and won't happen for the foreseeable future. The thing that will light everything on fire, if it happens, when it happens, is a vaccine. And that's what President Trump and the Republicans are really banking on, to the point where we're hearing, oh, well, we're going to get people ready for this vaccine even before the election, which that kind of faded away because people realized that wasn't realistic. But, sometime early 2021. But it's not just about developing it. It also is about it getting disseminated and trusted. And that's another big question. How will people respond? Will they trust whoever's the president, the vaccine will work?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, and we're even seeing that in some of the polling, right? There are many Americans who are saying, well, if the vaccine comes out and Donald Trump says it's safe, maybe I'm not going to necessarily trust it, right? So yeah, I think that's going to be out there. All right, we got two more somewhat open-ended questions here in the chat. So I'm going to start with one of them. It's basically asking, what is the sort of main advantage or the main difference that we would see if the Democrats win the presidency, right? If Joe Biden wins the presidency, and I would add, this is me adding it to the question, if Democrats had full control, right, of the presidency, the Senate, and the House, right? We know there are a lot of differences, a lot of changes that would happen, but what would some of those sort of more specific points be?
Well, one of the big things that is a movement in the Senate, and that Vice President Biden says that he now backs, he didn't before, and he's a longtime member of the United States Senate before he became vice president, is the ending of the filibuster. Now, this is a bit of a minutia, but it's a huge factor when it comes to your ability to have any effect in the Senate as the majority party. So in short, the minority party can tie up Senate business with a filibuster unless you get 60 votes out of 100 to break that filibuster. There's no way either party is going to get 60 votes in this coming election. If Democrats win, they'll have maybe a one vote majority, 51. And so even though they'll have that majority and be in the leadership, the Republicans will have the filibuster still, unless Democrats, through Senate rule changes, get rid of the filibuster. Presuming they do that, I think what you'll see is an administration and a Congress that will be spending a lot more on energy regulation, renewable energies, implementing elements of the Green Deal, a renewed focus on the Affordable Care Act's expansion. You'll see a much more, a resurgence of international presence, rebuilding the ties with the European Union. You'll see, I think, a continued hawkish stance towards China, but it won't be quite so overt. The situation with Iran and North Korea, I think we will continue to be opposed to them. And the Middle East, it's really hard to say what a Biden administration will do at this point. As far as the economy, I think the economy actually will continue to grow and move forward, whatever the Biden administration does. And I would go back again to, they're going to have their hands tied by what money they have left to spend, because there will be tax increases, but it will mostly be on the wealthy, but they won't be nearly as big as is being promised, because one thing wealthy people can do, and most countries experience this, is they can move their wealth somewhere else. And if there's too much tax threat, they will move it somewhere else. And so I don't think what we see in the platforms is what will actually happen given that reality.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair to say here. So we've got two more questions in here.
Okay.
One, and maybe we'll have time for at least one of them. And actually, I'll kind of follow up with this one just because it was sent later, but it's related kind of what we're talking about, which is whether you see a positive outlook for neglected commodities like steel and their states like Pennsylvania, like Ohio, and the place of main markets like China and Japan. So basically, how would a Biden administration handle some of these commodities like steel? Coal was not mentioned, but I'll mention it, right? And aluminum, stuff like that, going forward.
Good question. One of the things I think the COVID crisis has shown us is that there's a renewed attention and value being placed on the importance, for security reasons, of domestic production. We've gotten away from that. We've gone to this globalized model and the assumption that we'll always get along with our trading partners, even if we have little tiffs here and there. And that certainly changed when we figured out that 40% of our pharmaceuticals are coming from India and China, and a substantial percentage of the protection, the N95 masks, et cetera. And so I think we'll see in either administration more of an effort to grow domestic production of those things that are considered national security. And those commodities like steel and energy sources are among those commodities. When it comes to coal, I think the coal industry is dying, and it's going to continue to die, not because of any administration's policies, but because of the markets. The markets have made it clear we're going to natural gas, we're going to renewables, and quite frankly, even the Democratic platform says renewable. It says sustainable renewable energy, which is basically code for, and that includes nuclear. And you'll see nuclear becoming a bigger part of this, particularly with mini reactor research and that sort of thing. So I think you'll see that as a focus again on either administration. And there will probably be a more militant stance by either president if it comes to issues like dumping, where Korea, China, even Canada at times have been accused in the WTO of dumping, undercutting our steel prices, et cetera.
Yeah. All right. We have one more question. It's actually coming from, I'm actually kind of merging two questions coming from Facebook Live.
Okay.
And I wanted to make sure we get some of those in here. The first question was about DACA, right? What can we expect in relation to DACA under a Biden administration? And I'm going to add connected to that, which is the second question that was posed. How could that have an impact, or how might that affect Democrats' chances in Florida, Texas, and Arizona, right? 3 states with high concentrations of Latino voters who've traditionally been more Republican, right? Florida is a swing state, but more Republican. How could that end up affecting the election in those states?
Great question. Vice President Biden and the Democratic Party are firmly behind making DACA law and legalizing these people who were brought as young people, as children to the United States, and giving them legal status and a path towards citizenship. That's been their position for years. I think you'll also see on immigration in general, you'll see a more balanced, rational approach. I think you'll see a downturn in things like deportations and some of the terrible things that we've seen with people being kept in terrible conditions of detention, et cetera, the family separations. I think you'll see a lot of that diminish. By the same token, you could potentially in Trump see the same thing, because let's remember that as a second-term president, he is not running again. And if anything is consistent about Trump, it's the fact that he's unpredictable. So I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see in the new year a complete turnaround on DACA by Trump. But it would really, I think it's safer to say that we'd see a movement forward, because if Biden gets elected, I think you're more than likely going to see at least a 50-50 split in the Senate, or a 49-51 split, where it's such a close tie that there will be more of a reasonable approach, including Republicans from those states like Texas and Florida, et cetera, who will be more amenable to a reasonable kind of immigration reform that includes attention to the DACA folks and giving them legal status.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're almost out of time, but there's one final question. We'll just throw it in here because we got 2 minutes. There's a question here which is fairly open-ended, right? But it basically comes around to the issue of this listener is asking basically, right, that Donald Trump has lied to the American public about quite a few different things, most prominently, right, recently with this issue of COVID, as we've heard in these recordings from Woodward. And so why is it, the question really is kind of going towards, why is it that his supporters are still behind him despite that?
That's a great question, and one of the enduring mysteries of American politics. The short answer is, over the last, I'd say, going back to Vietnam and Watergate, the character of a president has become less of a value, and what has become more of a value to voters is what that president will do for me and my family, my community, however me is defined, my own personal interests. And so the American public is increasingly becoming more transactional about how they view the presidency and whoever occupies that office. Gone, I think, are the days of seeing the president as somebody to look up to, as an authority figure, as someone who, I hope you're like so and so when they and not just to become president, but become like this president. I think those days are largely gone. And so as a result, that's where you get people who continue to support Trump who may say, personally, I find him disgusting, but I support what he's doing with deregulation. I support what he's done with tax cuts. The economy's doing better. If it takes him to do it, fine, that's what I'll take. And I think that's the reason behind the fact that he's hovered between a low of 38% and a high of 46% in his poll approval ratings from the day he took office. And it's been one of the steadiest levels of polling that we've ever seen. But even with that, he still has a potential to get reelected.
Tom, Dr. Sutton, thank you. Thank you very much for this. This was a fascinating conversation. I think by the comments and by the sort of the interest in the comments and the level of the comments and the questions, I know this has been fascinating for our listeners. So thank you. Thank you very much for being with us here tonight.
Well, thank you, Sam. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. You have amazing students, and the questions they asked were fantastic, and all the other questions that came in, I'm really glad to have had the chance to participate.
Thank you. Well, thanks again for being here, and thank you to all of you who joined us here tonight. This was, I think, an excellent session. The Universidad de las Américas Puebla invites you to follow us on social media, including on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, right, where we publicize future events just like this one about the U.S. elections, but also about a range of other important topics that are sort of a public interest right now. Well, with that, I'll say good night, and thanks again.
Gracias y buenas noches.
Gracias.